Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. My name is Michael Martinez. This is the story of an event that happened to me in the summer of 2015, an experience that would change my life forever. Born and raised in a small town in Maine, I've always been an outdoors enthusiast. Fishing, hiking, camping, you name it, I loved it. I was known around town as an easygoing guy, always up for an adventure, with a dry sense of humor that often caught people off guard. My day job was as a mechanic, fixing up old cars and occasionally cracking jokes with customers about their antique vehicles. It was a Friday morning in early July when my old high school buddy, Chet Peters, and I decided to head up to Baxter State Park for a weekend camping trip. Chet and I had been thick as thieves since our teenage years. He was the kind of guy who could make you laugh even when your day was going to hell in a handbasket. We packed our gear, loaded up my beat-up Ford truck, and hit the road just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. The drive up was filled with our usual banter, reminiscing about old times and catching up on the latest town gossip. We arrived at Baxter State Park around noon. It was one of those perfect summer days that make you forget about all your worries. Clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, and the sun warming your skin just right. After checking in at the ranger station, we drove to a secluded campsite by a pristine lake far from the usual tourist spots. The site was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view of the sparkling water just a stone's throw away. We set up camp efficiently, having done this dance many times before. Our two-man tent went up quickly, and we arranged our gear under a tarp just in case the weather decided to turn on us. After a quick lunch of sandwiches and beer, we decided to go for a hike to stretch our legs and explore our surroundings. As we trekked through the dense forest, we joked about everything from our high school misadventures to the latest gossip in town. Chet, always the comedian, tried to scare me with tales of Bigfoot sightings in the area. "Come on, Chet," I laughed, giving him a playful shove. "The only monster around here is your cooking." We reached the top of a small hill and took a moment to enjoy the view. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. It was peaceful, the kind of tranquility you don't often find in the hustle and bustle of daily life. That night we sat by the campfire roasting hot dogs and sharing stories. The stars were out in full force, twinkling above us like tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet sky. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. Little did we know that this feeling wouldn't last, and our peaceful getaway was about to take a dark turn. The next morning we woke up refreshed and ready for more adventure. Over a breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, we pored over our park map, looking for an interesting spot to explore. "Hey, check this out," Chet said, pointing to a faded trail on the map. "Looks like there's an old abandoned cabin a few miles from here. Want to check it out?" I nodded, intrigued by the prospect. We packed some snacks and water, then set off on the overgrown trail. The path was barely visible in some spots, clearly rarely used, which only added to our sense of adventure. After a couple of hours of hiking, occasionally having to backtrack when we lost the trail, we finally found the cabin. It was a rickety old thing, barely standing, with vines creeping up its weathered sides. The roof sagged ominously, and several windows were broken, their jagged edges glinting in the midday sun. Chet, always the curious one, suggested we take a look inside. I hesitated for a moment, eyeing the dilapidated structure warily, but my own curiosity got the better of me. We stepped inside, and the place was a mess. Old furniture was strewn about, covered in a thick layer of dust. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and the musty smell of decay filled our nostrils. As we poked around, I found an old journal tucked away in a drawer. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but still legible. It was filled with notes about the local wildlife and strange sightings in the area. Some entries mentioned a cult that supposedly operated in the region back in the 1970s. "Hey, Chet, come look at this," I called out, flipping through the pages. He came over, and we spent the next hour reading through the journal, fascinated by its contents. The journal detailed bizarre rituals, strange symbols carved into trees, and sightings of hooded figures in the woods. It seemed like a bunch of nonsense, the ramblings of a paranoid mind, but it did make for an interesting read. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, we decided it was time to head back to our campsite. The hike back was quieter, both of us lost in thought about what we'd read in the journal. That night back at our camp, we talked about the journal and the supposed cult over our dinner of canned chili and crackers. Probably just some crazy old coot with too much time on his hands, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Chet agreed, but there was an unease in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Yeah, you're probably right," he said, but his laugh sounded forced. We turned in early, exhausted from the day's hike. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle lapping of the lake nearby. But my rest was interrupted by a noise outside the tent. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. At first I figured it was just a deer or some other animal, so I didn't think much of it. But the footsteps grew closer and more insistent. "Chet, you hear that?" I whispered, nudging my friend. He mumbled something unintelligible and rolled over. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything unusual, just trees and shadows. I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing, but sleep didn't come easily for the rest of the night. The next day we decided to stick closer to camp. The footsteps from the night before had left me feeling a bit on edge, but I didn't want to let on to Chet. He suggested we go fishing, so we grabbed our gear and headed down to the lake. As we fished, we talked about everything and nothing, just like old times. But there was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig made me jump. After a while, Chet hooked a big one, and his laughter filled the air as he struggled to reel it in. For a moment, it felt like everything was back to normal. We spent the rest of the day by the lake, grilling our catch for dinner and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. But as night fell, the unease returned. We sat by the campfire, but our usual banter felt forced. The flames cast flickering shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of the firelight, and more than once I thought I saw movement in the darkness beyond. That night the footsteps returned. This time they were accompanied by hushed voices. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I listened. I nudged Chet awake, and we both sat in silence, straining to hear. "Maybe it's just some other campers," Chet suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, trying to calm my nerves, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We both had our Swiss Army knives clutched in our hands as we waited for dawn. The following day, we decided to leave the park early. The sense of adventure had been replaced by a feeling of dread that neither of us could shake. We packed up our gear in record time, both of us eager to get back to civilization. As we hiked back to the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking presence. Every bird call sounded like a signal. We were about halfway back when we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the trail, was a crude wooden effigy adorned with animal bones and feathers. It looked like something out of a horror movie, its empty eye socket seeming to stare right through us. "Chet, what the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, man. Let's just keep moving." We picked up the pace, eager to get back to the safety of the truck. But the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I glanced over my shoulder more times than I could count, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear in the back and jumped in. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As we drove away, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. We had barely made it a mile down the road when we saw a figure standing in the middle of the path. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark, tattered clothes. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Who the hell is that?" Chet muttered, gripping the dashboard. I slowed the truck, not wanting to hit him, but also not eager to stop. The man didn't move, just stood there, staring at us. I honked the horn, hoping he would step aside, but he didn't budge. "We should go around him," I said, though my voice wavered. Chet nodded, and I edged the truck off the road, carefully navigating around the man. As we passed, I couldn't help but look at him. His eyes followed us, unblinking, until we were out of sight. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension in the cab palpable. Finally, Chet spoke up. "You think that was one of those cult members?" I shrugged, though the thought had crossed my mind. "I don't know, but whatever it was, I'm glad we're out of there." We made it back to town without further incident, but the experience left a mark on both of us. Chet and I didn't talk much about what happened after that. We went back to our normal lives, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. Something strange and unsettling had happened out there, and we didn't want to tempt fate by digging any deeper. A few weeks later, I was working late at the garage when Sheriff Davenport came in. He was an old friend of my dad's and had known me since I was a kid. "Hey, Michael, got a minute?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Sure thing, Sheriff. What's up?" I put down my wrench and wiped my hands on a rag. He looked around, making sure we were alone before speaking. "I heard you and Chet had a bit of a scare up at Baxter a while back." I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, you could say that. Why?" The sheriff sighed, his expression serious. "We've had some reports of strange activity up there recently. People going missing, weird symbols found in the woods, that sort of thing." My heart skipped a beat. "You think it's related to that old cult?" He shrugged. "Could be, or it could be something else. I just wanted to warn you to stay away from that area for a while." I nodded, the unease from our trip resurfacing. "Thanks for the heads up, Sheriff. I'll let Chet know, too." As he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter was just the tip of the iceberg. The next few months passed uneventfully, but the memory of that weekend lingered in the back of my mind. I found myself jumping at shadows and looking over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. One day, out of the blue, Chet called me. "Michael, we need to talk. Can you meet me at the diner?" "Sure thing, buddy. Be there in 15, I replied, curious about the urgency in his voice. When I arrived, Chet was already sitting at a booth, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. "What's going on, Chet?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. He leaned in, his voice low. "I've been having nightmares, man, about that trip. And it's not just dreams. I've been seeing things, shadows, figures outside my window at night. I think someone's watching me." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Have you told anyone else?" He shook his head. "Who'd believe me? They'd think I'm crazy, but I know what I've seen." I tried to reassure him, though my own doubts gnawed at me. "Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks. We had a scare, and it's messing with your head." Chet didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Yeah, maybe. Just keep an eye out, okay?" I promised I would. But as I left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, I started noticing things too. Small, barely noticeable at first. A car parked down the street that I didn't recognize. Footsteps outside my house at odd hours. I tried to brush it off, but it was hard to ignore. Then one night, it all came to a head. I was working late again when I heard a noise outside the garage. It was faint, like someone trying to be quiet. I grabbed a wrench and cautiously stepped outside. The night was still, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. I circled the building, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. Suddenly a figure darted out from behind a dumpster and ran towards the woods. Without thinking, I gave chase. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I sprinted after the intruder. We crashed through the underbrush, branches scratching at my arms and face. I was gaining on him when he stumbled and fell. I tackled him to the ground, wrench raised, ready to defend myself. But when I got a good look at his face, I froze. It was the same man we'd seen in the park, the one who'd blocked our path. His hood had fallen back, revealing a gaunt, haunted face. He stared up at me with wild eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Why are you following us?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger and fear. He didn't answer, just laughed. A low, broken sound that sent shivers down my spine. I tightened my grip on the wrench. "Talk, damn it." Before he could respond, there was a rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned just in time to see another figure emerge, this one wielding a knife. I barely had time to react before he was on me, slashing wildly. I fought back with everything I had, the two of us grappling in the dirt. I managed to knock the knife from his hand, but he was strong, and I was quickly losing ground. Just when I thought it was over, a gunshot rang out. The man slumped over, blood spreading across his chest. I looked up to see Chet standing there, his face pale, holding a smoking pistol. "Michael, are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, too stunned to speak. The man beneath me was dead, and the first one had vanished into the night. We stood there in silence for a moment, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. "We need to get out of here," Chet said, his voice shaking. I agreed, and we made our way back to the truck. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but it was tainted by the realization that this wasn't over. We went straight to the sheriff's office and told him everything. Sheriff Davenport listened carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each passing minute. When we finished our tale, he sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I'll send some deputies out there to investigate," he said finally. "But you two need to lay low for a while. Whoever these people are, they're dangerous." Chet and I spent the next few days holed up at his place, too scared to go out. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every sound and shadow. The sheriff called to update us a few days later. They'd found signs of a struggle, but no bodies. The man Chet had shot was gone, leaving only a trail of blood leading deeper into the woods. "It's like they vanished into thin air," the sheriff said, frustration evident in his voice. "We've got the state police involved now, but honestly, I don't know what to make of it all." The days turned into weeks, and gradually the fear began to fade. But the memory of that night never left us. We didn't talk about it much, but there was an unspoken understanding that we had survived something terrible, something that defied explanation. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. I went back to work at the garage, and Chet tried to move on with his life. But there was always a sense of unease lurking in the background, a feeling that we were being watched. We never went back to Baxter State Park, and whenever I saw someone I didn't recognize in town, I couldn't help but wonder if they were connected to what had happened. The cult, if that's what it was, seemed to have gone to ground, but I never quite shook the feeling that they were out there, waiting. Years passed, and the events of that weekend became a distant memory, something we only talked about in hushed tones late at night. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, or hear a noise outside my window, and I'd remember. Chet eventually moved away, looking for a fresh start in a new town. We kept in touch, but our conversations were always tinged with a hint of sadness, a reminder of what we'd been through. As for me, I stayed in Maine, running the garage and trying to live a normal life. But the experience had changed me. I was more cautious, less trusting of strangers. Sheriff Davenport retired a few years after the incident, but we stayed friends. Occasionally, over a beer, he'd bring up the case, wondering aloud what had really happened out there in the woods. We never found out, but maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. As the years went by, I often found myself thinking about that summer of 2015. The questions never really went away. Who were those people? What did they want? And why us? I'd lie awake at night turning these questions over in my mind, never finding any satisfactory answers. I tried to research the area's history, looking for any mention of cults or strange occurrences. I found a few vague references to disappearances in the 1970s, but nothing concrete. It was as if the whole incident had been carefully erased from history. Chet and I would talk on the phone every few months. He seemed to be doing better, having started a new life in Arizona. But I could still hear the tension in his voice whenever our conversation drifted too close to that fateful weekend. "You ever think about coming back for a visit?" I asked him once. There was a long pause before he answered. "I don't know, Michael. I don't think I can set foot in those woods again." I understood. Part of me wanted to go back, to face whatever was out there, but a larger part was content to let sleeping dogs lie. It was a crisp autumn day in 2023 when everything changed again. I was sorting through my mail when I came across a letter with no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky, barely legible. With a sense of trepidation, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same scrawling handwriting. As I read, I felt the blood drain from my face. "The Watchers are still watching. The woods hold secrets. Beware the hooded ones." At the bottom of the page was a crude drawing of the same symbol we'd seen on that effigy in the woods all those years ago. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call Chet, but before I could dial, I hesitated. Did I really want to drag him back into this? Hadn't we both been through enough? In the end, I put the phone down. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away in a drawer. Maybe one day I'd tell Chet about it. Maybe one day I'd find the courage to go back to Baxter State Park and face whatever was waiting there. But for now, I'd keep watching the shadows, always alert, always ready. Because some things once seen can never be unseen. And some mysteries once encountered never truly let you go. As I sit here writing this, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. It's been years since that summer, but the memories are as fresh as ever. I've tried to move on, to forget, but part of me knows that's impossible. I often wonder about the man who wrote that journal we found in the cabin. Did he ever find the answers he was looking for? Or did he, like us, spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, jumping at shadows? Life goes on. We adapt, we survive, and we try to find peace in the aftermath of chaos. But there are some things that you never truly forget, some experiences that change you forever. So if you ever find yourself in the woods of Maine, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from the shadows. And remember, not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are better left in the dark, where they belong. My name is David Rodriguez. The events I'm about to recount happened to me back in 2010, but they're as vivid in my mind as if they occurred yesterday. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memories flooding back like a tidal wave of fear and uncertainty. I grew up in Stillwater, a small town nestled in the heart of Montana. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where doors were left unlocked at night, and where the biggest excitement was usually the high school football game on Friday nights. Stillwater was a town frozen in time, resistant to change and content in its simplicity. Our main street consisted of a handful of shops, Joe's General Store, where you could find everything from fishing tackle to canned peaches, Mabel's Diner, famous for its apple pie and gossip in equal measure, and the Rusty Nail, our local watering hole. It wasn't much, but to us it was home. I worked as a mechanic at Frank's auto shop, a job I'd held since I was fresh out of high school. Frank had been more than just a boss to me. He'd been a mentor, a father figure of sorts. When he passed away in 2005, he left the shop to me. It wasn't a glamorous life by any means, but it was honest work, and I took pride in it. My days were spent elbow deep in engines, the smell of oil and grease a constant companion. I fixed everything from old Mrs. Johnson's temperamental Buick to Sheriff Green's patrol car. In a town like Stillwater, a good mechanic was worth his weight in gold, and I made sure to treat every vehicle as if it were my own. Evenings and weekends were for unwinding. My best friend Travis and I would often head to the Rusty Nail, where we'd shoot pool, nurse a couple of beers, and swap stories with the locals. Travis was a character, always ready with a joke or a wild tale. He worked as a forest ranger, and his job took him deep into the wilderness surrounding our town. He'd come back with stories of bear encounters and lost hikers, each tale more embellished than the last. Life in Stillwater had a predictable rhythm, as steady and unchanging as the ticking of a clock. We had our share of drama, of course, small-town politics, petty rivalries, the occasional scandal, but nothing that ever really rocked the boat. Looking back, I realize now how naive we all were, how unprepared for the darkness that was lurking just beyond the edges of our comfortable little world. It was a Friday in late September when everything changed. The air had started to take on that crisp quality that heralds the coming of autumn, and the leaves on the trees were just beginning to turn. Travis and I had made plans to spend the weekend at his family's old cabin, deep in the woods about an hour's drive from town. The cabin had been in Travis's family for generations. His great-grandfather had built it with his own hands, a testament to the pioneering spirit that had first brought settlers to this rugged part of Montana. It wasn't much to look at, just a single room with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, and a couple of old couches that doubled as beds. But it was our sanctuary, a place where we could escape the pressures of town life and reconnect with nature. We'd made this trip countless times before, but something felt different from the moment we set out. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to lengthen as we drove, or the unusual stillness in the air. Whatever it was, it set my nerves on edge. "Man, it's quiet tonight," Travis said as we turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin. His usual grin was absent, replaced by a furrowed brow and tight lips. "Yeah, maybe the wildlife's just taking a night off," I replied, trying to inject some levity into the situation. But the joke fell flat, swallowed up by the oppressive silence that surrounded us. The drive seemed to take longer than usual, the trees pressing in close on either side of the narrow road. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Travis fidgeted in the passenger seat, his eyes darting from side to side as if expecting something to leap out at us from the darkness. When we finally reached the cabin, I felt a momentary surge of relief. The familiar sight of the weathered wooden structure should have been comforting, but instead it only heightened my sense of unease. The cabin looked older somehow, more decrepit than I remembered. The porch sagged slightly and the windows seemed to stare back at us like empty, accusing eyes. "Home sweet home," Travis muttered as we climbed out of the truck. His attempt at humor fell flat, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. We unloaded our gear in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As I fumbled with the key to the cabin door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just darkness and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Inside, the cabin was much as we'd left it on our last visit. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and the air was stale and musty. Travis busied himself with starting a fire in the old stone fireplace while I unpacked our supplies. "Remember that time we got lost in the old mine?" Travis asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled over us. I chuckled, grateful for the distraction. "Yeah, we ended up wandering around in the dark for hours. I thought we'd never make it out." "Your face when we finally saw daylight, priceless." Travis grinned, some of his old spark returning. We spent the next hour swapping stories and memories, the familiar ritual helping to ease some of the tension that had built up during the drive. But as the night wore on, the strange feeling of wrongness returned, settling over us like a heavy blanket. I was just about to suggest we turn in for the night when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I turned my head, thinking it was Travis, but he was sound asleep on one of the couches. The sound came again, clearer this time, but still indistinct. It seemed to be coming from outside, carried on the night wind. "Travis," I hissed, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up. Do you hear that?" He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" I held up a hand for silence, straining my ears. But the whisper, if that's what it had been, was gone. All I could hear now was the crackling of the dying fire and the sound of the wind in the trees. "It's nothing," I said finally, more to convince myself than Travis. "Just the wind playing tricks on us. Let's get some sleep." But as I lay there in the darkness, staring up at the cabin's wooden ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Little did I know, our nightmare was just beginning. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew I was jerking awake to the sound of footsteps on the porch. The fire had burned down to embers, casting eerie shadows across the cabin's interior. For a moment I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or what had woken me. Then I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps like someone trying to sneak up on us. My heart began to race, pounding so hard I was sure it would burst out of my chest. I sat up, listening intently, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. Those were human footsteps. I reached over and shook Travis awake, clamping a hand over his mouth to stifle any noise he might make. His eyes flew open, wide with panic, but he quickly understood the situation. We lay there in silence, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled the cabin. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, I whispered, "We need to check it out." Travis nodded, his face pale in the dim light. We grabbed the closest things we could use as weapons, an old baseball bat for me, a rusty tire iron for Travis, and crept towards the door. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. I held up 3 fingers, counting down silently. When I reached 0, I flung the door open, ready to face whatever was out there. But there was nothing, just the darkness and the trees, standing silent sentinel around the cabin. We stepped outside, our breath visible in the cold night air. The moon had risen, casting a silvery light over the clearing, but it did little to dispel the shadows that seemed to writhe and twist at the edges of our vision. We searched around the cabin but found no signs of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. It was as if the footsteps had been a product of our imagination. Maybe it was just our imagination, Travis suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew what we had heard. We went back inside, bolting the door behind us. Sleep was out of the question now. We sat by the rekindled fire, talking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. Despite our best efforts to stay awake, we both eventually succumbed to sleep. The next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's dusty windows. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Surely, in the light of day, the terrors of the night would prove to be nothing more than an overactive imagination fueled by too many campfire stories. But as I sat up, stretching the kinks out of my back, I noticed Travis staring at something on the far wall, his face drained of all color. I followed his gaze, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, written on the wall in what looked horribly like dried blood, were the words, "We see you." "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of the cabin. Travis shook his head, his eyes never leaving the ominous message. "I don't know, man. I don't know." We packed up our stuff in record time, barely speaking as we threw our belongings into bags and loaded them into the truck. The drive back to town was a blur, the beautiful Montana landscape passing by unnoticed as we both grappled with what we had experienced. By unspoken agreement, we headed straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Green was an old-timer, a no-nonsense kind of guy who had been keeping the peace in Stillwater for as long as anyone could remember. He listened to our story with a skeptical look on his weathered face, his bushy eyebrows drawn together in a frown. "Boys," he said when we'd finished, "are you sure you weren't just spooked by the quiet out there? Maybe had a few too many beers?" "We know what we saw, Sheriff," I insisted. "Someone was out there, and they left that message." Sheriff Green sighed, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "All right, I'll send Deputy Harris out to check the place out. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. Probably just some kids playing a prank." We left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated and unheard. Over the next few days, we tried to go back to our normal routines, but things had changed. The town that had once felt so safe, so familiar, now seemed full of shadows and secrets. I found myself jumping at small noises, constantly looking over my shoulder. A week after our experience at the cabin, Deputy Harris reported back. He hadn't found anything, no message on the wall, no signs of intrusion. It was as if that night had never happened. But I knew it had. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that this was only the beginning. Life in Stillwater took on a surreal quality in the weeks following our experience at the cabin. On the surface, everything appeared normal. I still fixed cars at the garage. Travis continued his patrols in the forest, and the townsfolk went about their daily routines. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, there was an undercurrent of unease, at least for Travis and me. We tried to talk about what had happened, to make sense of it. But our conversations always seemed to circle back to the same unanswered questions. Who had been outside the cabin that night? Who had written that chilling message on the wall? And why had Deputy Harris found no trace of it? Travis threw himself into research, spending hours online reading about similar occurrences in other parts of the country. He started keeping a notebook, jotting down theories and connecting seemingly unrelated events. I humored him at first, but as the days passed, I began to worry about his growing obsession. "Look at this," he said one evening, shoving his notebook under my nose as we sat in the rusty nail. 3 hikers went missing in Glacier National Park last month. No trace of them was ever found. I sighed, taking a swig of my beer. "Travis, people go missing in national parks all the time. It's sad, but it happens. But what if it's connected? He pressed, his eyes feverish with excitement. What if whatever was at the cabin that night is behind these disappearances? I was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Sheriff Green. He nodded to us as he made his way to the bar, but I couldn't help noticing the worried frown on his face. "Everything okay, Sheriff?" I called out. He hesitated for a moment before making his way over to our table. "Well, boys, I'm not sure. We've had a couple of strange reports lately. People seeing shadows moving at the edge of town, weird noises in the night. Probably nothing but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Travis and I exchanged a look. This was the first we'd heard of any strange occurrences in town. "Any disappearances?" Travis asked, his voice tight. Sheriff Green's eyebrows shot up. "Now why would you ask that?" Travis shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just curious. With all the weird stuff happening, you know." The sheriff studied us for a long moment before replying. "No disappearances, not yet anyway. You boys hear anything, you let me know, you hear?" We nodded and Sheriff Green moved off to the bar. As soon as he was out of earshot, Travis leaned in close. "See, it's not just us. Something's going on in this town." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was letting his imagination run wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. The next day, Travis didn't show up for our usual morning coffee at Mabel's diner. I didn't think much of it at first. He'd probably just overslept or gotten called in early to work. But when he didn't answer my calls or texts, worry began to gnaw at me. By evening, with still no word from Travis, I decided to swing by his house. His truck was in the driveway, but there was no answer when I knocked on the door. Through the window, I could see his living room, looking exactly as it always did, except for the notebook lying open on the coffee table, a pen dropped haphazardly beside it as if he'd been in the middle of writing something when he was interrupted. My heart pounding, I called Sheriff Green. Within an hour, a search was underway. We combed Travis's house, the woods where he worked, even the old cabin. But there was no trace of him. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks and hope began to dwindle. The town buzzed with theories. Had Travis run off? Had he gotten lost in the woods? Or had something more sinister happened? I couldn't accept any of it. Travis was my best friend, and I knew him better than anyone. He wouldn't have just left without a word. And he was too experienced in the outdoors to get lost. Which left only one possibility, one that I didn't want to contemplate. As the official search wound down, I decided to conduct my own investigation. I started by going through Travis's house, looking for any clue that might lead me to him. That's when I found it. A second notebook, hidden away in the back of his closet. This one was different from the one he'd shown me at the bar. It was filled with frantic scribblings, drawings of strange symbols, and notes about occult practices. Page after page detailed bizarre occurrences around Stillwater livestock found mutilated in nearby farms, unexplained lights in the sky, and most disturbingly, a list of names. Some I recognized as people from neighboring towns who had gone missing over the years. Others were unfamiliar. At the back of the notebook was a crude map. It showed the area around Stillwater, with several locations marked with the same strange symbols that were scattered throughout the pages. One location, circled multiple times in red ink, caught my eye, an old abandoned building on the outskirts of town. I remembered that building. It had once been a small factory, but it had shut down decades ago. Kids used to dare each other to spend the night there, claiming it was haunted. I had always dismissed the stories as typical small-town folklore, but now, looking at Travis's notes, I wasn't so sure. With a sense of both dread and determination, I decided to investigate the building. I knew I should probably inform Sheriff Green, but something held me back. What if he dismissed my concerns again? No, this was something I had to do on my own. The next evening, I drove out to the abandoned factory. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows across the overgrown parking lot. The building loomed before me, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching darkness. I sat in my truck for a long moment, gathering my courage. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive away, to pretend I'd never seen Travis's notebook or the map. But the thought of my friend, possibly in danger, steeled my resolve. Armed with only a flashlight and the unsettling knowledge from Travis's notes, I approached the building. The main entrance was boarded up, but I found a side door that yielded to a firm push. It creaked open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the evening. The interior was a maze of shadows and rusted machinery. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the pressing darkness. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. As I explored deeper into the building, I began to notice strange markings on the walls. They were similar to the symbols in Travis's notebook, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. My skin crawled, but I pressed on. I don't know how long I wandered through that labyrinth of decay and shadows. Time seemed to lose all meaning. But eventually, I found myself in what must have once been the main production floor. And there in the center of the room was something that made my blood run cold. A large circle had been drawn on the floor, surrounded by candles, and more of those unsettling symbols. In the center of the circle was a chair, and tied to that chair, unconscious but alive, was Travis. I rushed forward, relief and fear warring within me. "Travis!" I called out, my voice echoing in the vast space. "Travis, can you hear me?" As I reached the edge of the circle, Travis stirred. His eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "David?" he mumbled, his voice weak. How did you find me?" "Your notebook," I said, working to untie the ropes that bound him. "I followed your map. Who did this to you?" But before Travis could answer, a sound from behind me made me freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like that night at the cabin. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. A figure stood at the edge of the room, cloaked in shadow. As it stepped into the dim light cast by the candles, I saw that it wore a long, dark robe, its face hidden beneath a deep hood. "Welcome, David Rodriguez," the figure said, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been expecting you." I stood there, frozen in shock and fear, my mind struggling to process what was happening. The hooded figure took another step forward, and I instinctively moved to place myself between it and Travis. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want with us?" The figure chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "We are the keepers of the veil, guardians of secrets beyond your comprehension. And as for what we want..." It paused, tilting its head slightly. "We want you to join us, David, you and Travis both." From the shadows behind the first figure, more robed forms emerged. They moved silently, forming a circle around us. I counted at least a dozen of them, each as eerily still as the next. "Join you?" I echoed, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" The leader, for that's clearly what the first figure was, raised its hands, pushing back its hood. I gasped as I recognized the face beneath. It was Sarah Winters, the town librarian. She'd always been a bit odd, keeping to herself mostly, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. "David," Sarah said, her voice now normal but filled with an unsettling enthusiasm, "we've watched you for years, you and Travis both. We've seen your potential, your curiosity, your willingness to look beyond the veil of ordinary reality." "The cabin," I breathed, realization dawning. "That was you?" Sarah nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "A test of sorts. We needed to see how you'd react, if you'd pursue the mystery or try to forget about it." "And the disappearances?" Travis spoke up from behind me, his voice stronger now. "The missing hikers, the strange sightings around town? Was that all you too?" Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "Regrettable but necessary sacrifices. The powers we work with demand tribute, and not everyone is suitable for our purposes." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in small towns like Stillwater, cults, human sacrifices. These were the stuff of horror movies, not real life. "You're insane," I said, shaking my head. "All of you. I don't know what you think you're doing, but it stops now. We're leaving, and we're going straight to Sheriff Green." Sarah's expression hardened. "I'm afraid we can't allow that, David. You see, you have a choice to make. Join us, embrace the power and knowledge we offer, or become one of those regrettable sacrifices I mentioned." As if on cue, the circle of robed figures began to close in around us. I looked around frantically, searching for a way out, but we were completely surrounded. David, Travis whispered urgently behind me. The symbols on the floor, if we can smudge them, break the circle. I nodded imperceptibly, understanding his plan. We had to act fast. In one fluid motion I lunged forward, tackling Sarah to the ground. The other cultists surged forward, but in the confusion Travis managed to kick over several of the candles surrounding the circle. The flames caught on the dry, rotted floorboards, quickly spreading. Smoke filled the air as chaos erupted. The cultists scrambled to contain the fire, their carefully orchestrated ritual forgotten in the face of real danger. Travis and I seized our chance, making a break for the exit. We ran through the twisting corridors of the old factory, the sound of pursuit close behind us. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to see and breathe. Just when I thought we might not make it, we burst through a door and into the cool night air. We didn't stop running until we reached my truck. As we sped away, I could see the glow of the fire lighting up the night sky behind us. Part of me felt guilty for starting the blaze, but a larger part knew it had been our only chance of escape. "Where are we going?" Travis asked as we hit the main road, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Sheriff Green," I said grimly. "He needs to know about this, all of it." The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews, fire investigations, and stunned disbelief. The story of the Keepers of the Veil, as the press dubbed them, sent shockwaves through Stillwater and the surrounding areas. Sheriff Green, to his credit, took our story seriously this time. The fire had destroyed much of the physical evidence in the old factory, but what remained was damning enough. The symbols, the ritual circle, traces of blood that didn't belong to either Travis or me. It all painted a disturbing picture. Sarah Winters and several other members of the cult were arrested, but many more had escaped in the chaos of the fire. The investigation expanded, linking the group to numerous disappearances and unexplained events across the state. As for Travis and me, we were hailed as heroes by some, viewed with suspicion by others. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. We had stumbled onto something dark and dangerous, and we had survived, but the cost was high. The Stillwater we knew, the simple, quiet town we had grown up in, was gone. The veil of normalcy had been ripped away, revealing the shadows that had always lurked beneath the surface. Nothing would ever be the same. In the weeks that followed, as the media frenzy began to die down and a semblance of normalcy returned to Stillwater, Travis and I often found ourselves sitting on my porch, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. "Do you think we'll ever know the full truth?" Travis asked one evening, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "About what they were really trying to do, what they believed in?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't know, Travis. Part of me doesn't want to know. Some truths are better left uncovered." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. We sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. "What do we do now?" he finally asked. It was a question I'd been grappling with myself. How do you go back to a normal life after experiencing something like that? How do you unsee what you've seen, unlearn what you've learned about the darkness that exists in the world and in people? "We live," I said simply. "We remember, we stay vigilant, but we live. We can't let them take that away from us too." Travis smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "Yeah," he agreed. "We live." As the sun set over Stillwater, casting long shadows across the land, I felt a mix of emotions. Fear for what might still be out there, sadness for the innocence we'd lost, but also hope. Hope that by shining a light on the darkness, we had made our town, and maybe the world, a little bit safer. The events of that summer changed us, changed Stillwater, in ways both subtle and profound. The Keepers of the Veil were gone, their secrets scattered to the wind. But in their wake, they left a town that was a little more cautious, a little less trusting, but also a little more aware of the complex, sometimes frightening world that existed beyond its borders. As for me, David Rodriguez, I continued to work as a mechanic, fixing cars and chatting with customers. But now I paid a bit more attention to the stories people told, to the shadows at the edge of town, to the things that didn't quite add up. And every now and then, when the night was especially dark and quiet, I'd remember that whisper in the woods, that message on the cabin wall, "We see you." And I'd wonder, with a shiver running down my spine, if somewhere out there in the darkness they were still watching, It's been years since that fateful summer, and life in Stillwater has settled into a new kind of normal. To an outsider, our town might look much the same as it always has, a quaint, quiet place nestled in the Montana wilderness. But those of us who lived through it, who know the truth, we see things differently now. Travis left town not long after everything happened. The experience had changed him profoundly, awakening a restless curiosity that Stillwater could no longer satisfy. Last I heard, he was traveling the world, investigating other strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. We keep in touch, swapping stories and theories via email. Sometimes I worry about him, about the paths his quest might lead him down, but I understand his need to search for answers. As for me, I stayed. Stillwater is my home, for better or worse, and I couldn't bring myself to leave. Someone needs to keep watch, to remember what happened here, and make sure it never happens again. Sheriff Green retired last year, the weight of everything that had happened finally taking its toll. The new sheriff is young, energetic, and thankfully open-minded about the town's recent history. We've worked together to implement some changes, better reporting systems for missing persons, community watch programs, that sort of thing. Small steps, but important ones. The old factory was demolished, the land reclaimed by nature. No one wanted to build there, not after everything that had happened. Sometimes I drive out there just to sit and think. The wildflowers that now bloom where the cult once performed their dark rituals seem like a fitting symbol of renewal, of light overcoming darkness. But the echoes of what happened still linger. Sometimes late at night when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear whispers carried on the breeze. Visitors to town occasionally report strange sightings or unexplained phenomena. Most of the time it turns out to be nothing, tricks of light and shadow, overactive imaginations. But every now and then something happens that makes me wonder if we really did manage to close that door to the unknown, or if we just pushed it slightly ajar. I keep Travis's notebooks locked away in a safe deposit box at the bank. I've never shown them to anyone else, never spoken about some of the darker theories and speculations contained within those pages. Some knowledge is too dangerous, too tempting, but I keep them just in case. A reminder, a warning, a last line of defense if the shadows ever threaten to overwhelm us again. As I sit here on my porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, I find myself reflecting on the nature of truth and reality. We go through our lives thinking we understand the world, that we know the rules. But the truth is, we've only scratched the surface. There are depths to reality that we can scarcely imagine, forces at work beyond our comprehension. But I've also learned that there's strength in community, in standing together against the darkness. The people of Stillwater may not know all the details of what happened that summer, but they know enough. There's a resilience here now, a quiet determination to protect our town and each other. So yes, the shadows are still out there. The whispers still echo in the silence. But we're ready for them now, watching, waiting, standing guard at the edge of the known world. And if the keepers of the veil, or something like them, ever resurface, they'll find that we see them too, and we'll be ready. As the last light fades from the sky and the stars begin to twinkle overhead, I raise my glass in a silent toast to Travis, wherever he might be, to Sheriff Green, enjoying his well-earned retirement, to the people of Stillwater who faced the unimaginable and emerged stronger, and to the mystery that still lies at the heart of it all, the endless dance of light and shadow that defines our world. The night deepens, and with it comes a familiar mix of emotions, a touch of fear, a measure of respect for the unknown, but above all a deep appreciation for the quiet moments, the simple joys that make life worth living. Whatever lies beyond the veil, whatever forces might be at work in the shadows, this much I know, here and now, in this moment, I am alive. And that in the end is what truly matters. The clock strikes midnight, and another day in Stillwater comes to an end. I finish my drink and head inside, locking the door behind me, a habit I've never quite been able to break since that summer. As I settle into bed, I can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Who would have thought that David Rodriguez, small-town mechanic, would end up as a guardian against dark, otherworldly forces? Life, I've learned, has a way of surprising you. All you can do is face each day with courage, kindness, and an open mind. The rest, well, the rest is a mystery. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly as it should be. It was September 21st, 1997, when my life changed forever. I'm Ellis, and if I wasn't such a stubborn old mule, I wouldn't have this story to tell. But I do, and it's a tale that still haunts me to this day. I had decided to rent a small cabin tucked along Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri for a month. The plan was simple: do some fishing, enjoy the quiet, and maybe finish that novel I'd been putting off for years. Little did I know that this peaceful retreat would turn into a nightmare that would follow me for the rest of my life. The first few days were uneventful. I set up my fishing gear, stocked the cooler with beer, and settled into a comfortable routine. The tranquility of the lake was a welcome change from the bustling streets of St. Louis, where I'd been living for the past decade. My ex-wife always said I had a knack for finding trouble, but out here, surrounded by nature, what could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, everything. It was on the fourth night that I first noticed something was off. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, when I felt an inexplicable urge to check the perimeter of the property. Call it instinct or paranoia, but something didn't feel right. I grabbed my flashlight and began to circle the cabin. The woods seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper and more menacing. As I rounded the back of the property, my light caught something that made my blood run cold. Tracks. But not just any tracks. These were large, like dog prints, but wrong. The claws were too long, the shape of the pad different from any animal I'd ever encountered. And I'd seen my fair share of wildlife over the years. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deformed coyote or a particularly large wolf, but deep down I knew I was lying to myself. Whatever made these tracks wasn't natural. That night I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin suddenly felt too exposed, its thin walls offering little protection against whatever might be lurking in the darkness. At 2 a.m. I jolted awake, drenched in a cold sweat. Something was moving outside. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, but it grew closer, more distinct. Heavy footfalls, the snapping of twigs, and a low, guttural sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I lay there, frozen in fear, straining my ears to track the movement outside. The cabin was just one big room with nowhere to hide if something decided to break in. My eyes darted to the rifle I'd left leaning against the far wall. It might as well have been miles away. That's when I saw it. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. And there, just beyond the tree line, stood a figure. It was hunched over but still unnaturally tall, with an odd loping gait and a massive head. Even from this distance I could see its eyes reflecting the moonlight, a sickly yellow-green that seemed to glow with an inner fire. And it was staring directly at the cabin, directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the creature begin to move. Its steps were deliberate, steady, like a predator circling its prey. This was no panicked animal. This thing, whatever it was intelligent, and it was hunting me. I knew I wouldn't have time to reach the rifle before it got to the cabin. So, operating on pure instinct, I did the only thing I could think of. I let out the loudest, meanest yell I could muster. "Get out of here!" I roared, my voice cracking with fear and desperation. To my surprise, it worked. Sort of. The creature halted its advance, tilting its head to the side like a confused dog. For a brief moment I dared to hope that I had scared it off. Then it let out a sound that froze my blood in my veins. It was a bone-deep snarl, filled with rage and hunger. But there was something else mixed in with it, something that chilled me to my core. It almost sounded like laughter, as if my pathetic attempt to scare it away was amusing. The creature took a few more steps forward, then stopped again. I used the moment of hesitation to lunge for my rifle. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the weapon, but I managed to raise it and take aim. I didn't bother with a warning shot. I aimed straight for its chest and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the quiet night. The creature howled, a sound of pain and fury that echoed across the lake. For a split second I thought I'd done it. I'd wounded the beast, driven it away. Then it started running, straight at me. That was my breaking point. Terror overrode every other instinct. I turned, fumbled with the back door, and bolted into the woods. The creature's roars of rage followed close behind. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I crashed through the underbrush, tripping over roots and tearing my clothes on thorns. Every time I thought I'd lost it, I'd hear that bone-chilling snarl again, followed by the thunder of its footsteps. Just when I was sure I couldn't take another step, when my lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead, I saw it. A dirt road winding through the trees. Salvation. I burst out of the forest and threw myself across the road, gasping for breath. Headlights suddenly flared to life as a car screeched to a stop mere feet from where I lay. "What the hell are you?" a man's voice started to say, but then he saw my face. The blood, the tattered clothes, the sheer terror in my eyes. "Help me," I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Something's out there. Something's—" That's when the creature emerged from the trees. The man shouted something unintelligible. The car engine revved, and then, to my horror, he sped away, tires squealing, leaving me sprawled there on the road. I saw the creature loom over me, its teeth gleaming in the darkness. I scrambled backward, my mind blank with terror. I closed my eyes, waited for the pain, for the teeth tearing into my flesh, but it never came. After what felt like an eternity, I opened my eyes. I was alone. The creature had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I sat there for what felt like hours, shaking uncontrollably, staring into the woods where the creature had disappeared. Eventually, the shock wore off enough for me to stand. I made my way back to the cabin on autopilot, not even bothering to see if that thing was lurking nearby. My belongings were still inside, untouched, but I couldn't stay. I grabbed my essentials, shoved them into a backpack, and practically ran for the road. By some miracle, I managed to hitch a ride with a trucker hauling lumber. He looked at me like I was deranged, but didn't ask many questions. He dropped me off at a gas station outside of Branson, the nearest town of any size. From there, I called a cab, made it to the bus station, and somehow ended up back in my dingy St. Louis apartment. The aftermath is a blur. I barely slept, barricaded myself inside, kept seeing those glowing eyes in the dark, hearing its snarls every time I closed my eyes. When I could bring myself to eat, I choked down protein bars and takeout, terrified to go to a grocery store with its wide-open spaces. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like at any moment that thing could come crashing through my window. They found me like that. The police. Turns out the trucker had reported what happened. He thought at first he must have hit an animal, but then saw my abandoned cabin. Bloodstains in the dirt, the torn clothing, signs of a struggle. The cops didn't believe my story, of course. Animal attack, they said. Maybe a feral hog gone rogue. They tried to explain away the eye shine, the tracks that didn't add up. I didn't argue. I just wanted them out of my apartment so I could be alone again. Funny, all those years I'd craved solitude, and now I didn't know how to handle it. The silence was oppressive, filled with imagined sounds and movements in the shadows. News of the incident got out. A small-town paper ran a story. Crazed fisherman claims monster attack. I became a figure of ridicule. It didn't help that I couldn't even bring myself to go back to the lake to identify the scene, if there even was anything left to identify. They searched, but didn't find anything conclusive. Just more confirmation for the official story. Case closed. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had blacked out, had some kind of psychotic break, imagined the whole thing. The doctors certainly thought so. They prescribed pills, therapy, the whole 9 yards. I pretended to go along with it to get them off my back, but I never took the meds. Because deep down I know what I saw. I know I'm not crazy. And I know that whatever was out there, it's still out there. I couldn't stay in St. Louis after that. Too many memories. Too many pitying looks from neighbors who'd seen the news reports. I packed up what little I had and moved to Kansas City. Urban sprawl, constant noise, crowds I used to hate. Now they're my security blanket. If that thing comes looking, it won't find me so easily in the city. I work a night job as a security guard in a downtown building. It's boring work, but it pays the rent. More importantly, it lets me be up and alert when the world is asleep. When those things, whatever they are, might be on the move. I keep the lights on, every single one. I've got a pair of binoculars by my desk, and I scan the parking lot every half hour. I've got a pistol, too, tucked in a drawer against regulations. I haven't had to use it yet, but its presence is comforting. I don't write much anymore. The old stories, horror, westerns, the occasional romance, well, they seem childish now. My life became a horror story, one I didn't ask for and can't escape. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I go back in my mind to that night at the cabin. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't yelled, if it had gotten into the cabin. What if it had reached me there on the road? Maybe then somebody would have believed me once they found the remains. Or maybe not. Maybe they'd just write it off as another weird unsolved case file gathering dust in some forgotten office. Every now and then I'll see something in the news that makes my blood run cold. A hiker gone missing in the Ozarks. Livestock mutilated in some farmer's field. Campers telling tales of strange noises in the night. These stories don't make a big splash. They quickly fade away, replaced by the latest scandal or disaster. But I see them. And I wonder how many others are out there. How many people have seen something like I did. How many have been labeled crazy, unable to let go of what they experienced. I wonder if we'll ever connect, or if we're doomed to carry this terrible knowledge alone. And mostly, I wonder if someday those headlights will shine into my building's parking lot. Not those of a random car, but a pair of glowing yellow-green eyes in the darkness. I wonder if, when it comes for me, it'll finally be over one way or another. Until then, I'll keep watching, keep waiting, because I know the truth. The monsters are real, and they're still out there,